little bit for a couple of minutes about kind of what I've been doing in this kind of area, and then we'll get into talking about what they've been doing, which is really quite fascinating. I had an interesting conversation with a colleague this morning. So one of the ways that, again, most of you have met me at this point, so what I do for a living is I manage a mutual fund, so that's kind of my main job. But one of the things I've been doing on the side for the last 10 years now is to help fund a center on climate change in Bangalore. So it's basically located at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, and it's called the Vidya Center for Climate Change. And quite frankly, when we set this up, it was set up by my boss, my former boss, and a colleague at the company I work at, because he's got a number of centers around the world called the Grantham Institute for the Protection of the Environment and various things like that. And basically the thinking when we set this up was, well, it's great to do research on climate change, but at the end of the day, the only way you're really going to get anything done is by affecting government policy. And so the thinking was that if you're located at the Indian Institute of Science, which is kind of the premier research institute for science in India, then if the government wants to know something about climate change, who are they going to call? And that's exactly how it worked. So 3 or 4 years ago, if you recall, when Mr. Modi was first elected, he was actually quite hostile to a lot of stuff about climate change and about India participating in any kind of climate change accord. But a month before the Paris meeting, he called the director of our center to come and spend a day with him in Delhi. And we like to think that we had some influence on how India kind of decided to sign the contract and things like that. So anyway, so the point is, that at the end of the day, for me, was kind of the big win. Because at the end of the day, we hoped we had some effect on policy change. Anyway, so I'm here today to basically talk about what you guys do. And I have to say, it's a really fascinating model of how giving works and how your organization kind of serves as a facilitator. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what your model is?
I think I'll just go back to the start when EdelGive is a financial services group based in Mumbai. And the founders, and my husband is the chair and CEO of EdelGive Group. When we actually set up the company, one of the sort of founding principles was that when we started making sustainable profit, we'd give a small percentage of that back to society. And the thinking at that time was that the founding team, we were all people from very simple middle-class backgrounds who had the incredible opportunity to great education at a time when education was not so expensive. Born right time, we set up the company also just at the beginning of the reforms process in India, and everything, kind of, was also the product of great luck and fortune. And that's how we started, but sometime around 2000 was when I actually joined the group. I was an investment banker before. I joined as CFO in 2000, and right until the IPO, when I served as CFO, my job was also to make these allocations to nonprofits that we'd meet. And like most other corporates, it was unstructured, it was ad hoc. You'd meet a founder, you'd like what they told you, and you'd make a grant. It was only around the time of the IPO when I wanted to step down as CFO that I got an opportunity to look at and visit a lot of the nonprofits that we'd funded. And it was a very interesting journey because irrespective of the pedigree of that organization, we had funded Baba Amte's Anandwan. I had met him just before he passed away. We had funded a very small school in Calcutta. We'd funded a residential school for the children of commercial sex workers in Sholapur. We had all these different non-profits that we'd funded, and each of the visits really showed me that the real challenge on the ground was not just funding. It was also the complete lack of organization capacity and no advice or funding for that for nonprofits. And some of us, or most of us here, are entrepreneurs in one way or another, and we know the importance of not just great business models, but also what goes behind it, the back end, the systems, the processes, the people. And this is an area that is completely ignored as far as from the funder side when it comes to funding of nonprofits. And so we set up a model that said that we would not only fund, but we'd also go in to diagnose what were the critical issues that nonprofits were facing when it came to growth and scale, and also provide that support, and that the employees of Edelweiss would do that pro bono on their time. So that model has sort of developed from 2008 in a formal way today. We fund 45 nonprofits currently all over India. And we have a very strong employee engagement program out of Edelweiss, but along with that, we've also helped set up other organizations that can provide this support to nonprofits. So our journey has been, that of being highly collaborative, keeping the nonprofit at the center of everything we do, and really build a model where we can also invite other funders to come join us, because our platform is available to all, it's zero cost, and we anyway do all the due diligence, all the monitoring. And in this way, we've sort of built a kind of a philanthropic asset management model where 50% of our money comes from Edelweiss, but 50% of our money also comes from other large foundations, corporates, high net worths, including foundations based here like the Gates Foundation and the Ford Foundation, but also large corporates like HDFC, and other large multinationals as well out of India, who feel that they now have a portfolio of organizations that have gone through the rigor of due diligence and pre-funding, that they have the confidence of going in and then becoming long-term partners of those organizations.
So just to clarify, so let's say suppose that I'm a wealthy person in this country and I want to give back to India, but I don't really have a good sense of, okay, I hear all these horror stories about how there's, corruption and this and that. And so it seems to me that you're kind of a one-stop shop, that I could come to you and say, look, I want to give money to this particular kind of area. And that you would say, all right, these are the kind of organizations, and then you would effectively manage that process. And from what I understand, since the costs are borne by Edelweiss, in some sense that there's no middleman cost that you guys are taking out. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think the issues that you mentioned in terms of lack of, there's a bit of a trust deficit. We don't know who to fund. We don't know whether impact is really happening. Just to give you an idea, we have 3.5 million NGOs in India of all kinds. And if you actually see some of the studies, it's only 90,000 NGOs that, and that's a large number, but 90,000 out of those 3.5 million that have some sort of credibility, or they have gone through some sort of a due diligence process, either by organizations like GIVE or GuideStar and others. So it's always a challenge. And the sort of principle behind our model is that there are very large NGOs like Pratham. Many of you do fund Pratham. There's Akshay Patra, there's Magic Bus, and they really do need the funding. But there are a number of extremely strong, credible, small and medium-sized organizations in India who don't have the same platform to access the large philanthropic capital that's available here, or even in our own country, even in India. Their ability to go to a corporate and access the 2% CSR is highly limited. And our idea is we really believe in the strength of small and medium organizations because they're highly connected to their communities. They understand the challenges. We just heard the Sukarma story. That story is powerful because she knows her community. And there are millions, there are thousands of such NGO founders of very strong, credible models, but really need that leg up to get onto scale and to be able to serve larger communities than what they're doing currently. And our idea is to get into that, almost like a VC, get into that early stage and be available until they can be funded by larger, more sophisticated institutional funders and high net worths.
So if I could use an investing analogy, that maybe you use a big bulk of your investing money in maybe large-scale stuff like Pratham and things like that, but then you should also have an early stage giving, which would be through somebody like yourselves to access organizations that one would never really know about over here.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, another analogy is actually the LPGP model is effectively what we're doing. We put in our own money. We put in our expertise, we provide access to networks, whether they are, networks that provide capacity building, they're networks that provide HR or audit or technology or accounting support. And then they, reach a sort of a size that makes them very attractive to people who are saying, okay, how do I now hold your hand onto, sort of a bigger journey?
Excellent. Any other?
Yeah, I'd love to sort of touch upon what Arjun is doing at the climate change work that you're doing at the ISC. And one of the things, and I've said that a couple of times, so some of you may have heard me saying this in this forum, is that along with funding, the large number of NGOs that we have, and there are some very, very critical areas, and we need to be more strategic about where we fund, who we fund. But there are also institutional issues that we need to fund. And I think what Arjun is trying to do at the Center for Climate Change is really to fund institution building. And there is, in the last 5 years, 5 to 10 years, I would say, a huge movement really in India towards building these institutions. I think the first real fundraise that we saw for institution building happened with Ashoka University. Some of you may be familiar with that, which was the first private sector liberal arts institution. But along with that, we have the Bennett Coleman University, we have Azim Premji University, and we have Kriya, which Nandan and a whole team are setting up in Chennai. So there's a lot of movement now under really bringing liberal arts education into India, and that's again part of building institutions, because great things happen when you get great educational institutions that are not necessarily affiliated to government. And then now we have the Indian School for Development Management, which is kind of like an MBA for development sector professionals. And we need a lot more of that thinking as well, which I think with a lot of you here, with experience of being here and seeing the institution development that happened here, you can provide us a window. And it's not necessarily around education or development management or public policy. It's about climate change, it's about sustainable, it's like what Nandan's doing with the Institute of Human Settlements and really looking at urban planning issues. So there's a lot of that kind of opportunity also available. While there are grassroots NGOs that we still have, we have great, even what Chris is trying to do with AI and neuroscience, and there's a whole, or the Wadhwanis are trying to do again with AI. So there's a lot of that kind of opportunity also that's available, or what Prakhar is trying to do with the Indian School of Democracy. So there's those kinds of opportunities also that we will now have a window into.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting almost to the end of our time, but if I could just tell you one thing that, we talk about climate change and the impacts of climate change, and the thing that most of you probably don't realize is that a fair amount of the troubles in the world that exist today have to do with climate change. And that has specifically to do with what happened in Egypt and what happened in Syria. That is basically, you had a long drought in both Syria and in Egypt. So in Egypt's case, what happened, the drought causes food prices to rise. That caused food price riots, and that is what caused the Arab Spring. So the Arab Spring was directly related to climate change. Similarly, the Syrian civil war really began as a result of the drought and people, essentially refugees, moving from the countryside to the cities. And that was a direct cause of the Syrian civil war. So the point is that you can see this happening in India. You can see this happening anywhere, right? I mean, when you get this kind of climate change effects, it has profound impacts on societies. So it causes refugees, it causes, all kinds of societal problems. So anyway, the point is that climate change is not just some esoteric idea that we in the West want to kind of deal with. It has a real impact on real people's lives, and increasingly it will affect people's lives in places like India before it will affect us, because we are rich enough to kind of do something about it, but places like India are not. So let me give you, to end with, let me give you a small example of something that the Devecha Center did, which I have to say is very pleasing. So one of the people who works for the Devecha Center is a person called Professor Kulkarni. He's one of the world's leading glaciologists, and he has for the last 30 years spent every single summer up in the Himalayas studying the glaciers. So literally, he's one of those few people who actually has data, pre-satellite data of the melting of the Himalayan glaciers, and so he's been writing about that. So now about 3 or 4 years ago, one of the things that became available was some new remote sensing technology that you had satellites, but so you could see these lakes, but essentially you couldn't estimate the depth of these lakes. So what came about was this new sensing technologies. You could actually see that you could sense the depth of a lake from a satellite technology. So anyway, one of the problems that glacial melting causes is something called glacial lakes. So as the glacier melts, you will have a valley which will fill up with water, and at the end of the valley will be a big ice plug. The problem is that one of these days, or one day, that ice plug will melt, and then all this water will go flooding through. And so what he identified was this place in Sikkim called the South Lonak Glacier. And what he basically showed through all these calculations and through satellite data was exactly the volume of water that was in this lake, and as a result, what would happen, because there's a big population center downstream. So if this thing broke, it would actually cause a fairly big catastrophe for a large population center. And so, as he said to me, he said, you know, I published this paper in an academic journal, and less than 5 days later, he got a call from the chief minister of Sikkim saying, holy shit, what are we going to do about this? You know? And so they hired the center to do kind of a mitigation study. And they came up with a remarkably simple solution, which is, well, let's siphon the water out. You know? And so they came up, so you can see photos of it on the web. Basically, it's just a big plastic pipe about that wide across, and it literally goes from one end over the top to the other side, and they just, for the last 3 years, have been siphoning the water out of this lake. You know, so it's a very low-tech solution which costs practically nothing. But the point is that because we were able to do the science, we were able to identify a problem that could actually be solved. But that's not true. As he said to me, there are 50 more of these in the Himalayas that he's identified so far. Fortunately, not all of them are, you know, near population centers. Anyway, do you have any final thoughts?
I think we're out of time, so thank you so much. Thank you for the
Thank you. Thank you.